ahead and close your Chromebooks and get out your notes. 8.1, perpendicular and angular bisectors. Okay. These notes are not very long, so I wanted to go ahead and get started. That way maybe on Monday we can go ahead and get our assignment, or at least have our notes most of the way finished. All right, it says students will be able to use perpendicular and angle bisectors to find measures of segments and angles. Okay. So we've discussed perpendicular and angle bisectors before. Okay, so this is first just a review of what each one is. A perpendicular bisector is a line segment or array that is perpendicular to the segment at its midpoint. So a line segment array that is perpendicular to the segment at its midpoint. And remember, perpendicular means they meet at a 90-degree angle. They meet at a right angle. Okay, so if you look at this segment here, AB, you have segment AB, and then you have line CP going through the segment AB. How I know it's the perpendicular bisector, it's marked perpendicular with that right angle, and these two segments are marked congruent. AP is congruent to PB, so that tells me that P is its midpoint. So that's how I can tell it's a perpendicular bisector. It's perpendicular, and it cuts it in half. It cuts it into two congruent segments. Okay? A word that you all need to know the meaning of is equidistant. A point is equidistant from two figures when the point is the same distance from each figure. So equidistant means the same distance. Now congruent segments. So a point's equidistant when it's the same distance. So if I was standing right here in the middle, I would be the same distance to Sydney and Taylor. If I was standing right here in the middle, I'd be the same distance from Lincoln and Sydney. Okay, so it's equidistant. So now that we know what those two things are, the perpendicular bisector theorem says if a point is on the perpendicular bisector, then it's equidistant to the two endpoints. So see how point C is on the perpendicular bisector, and I know it's on it because this is perpendicular and these are congruent. So what that means is, if I were to draw a line from C to A, and let's pretend it's a straight line, it would be congruent to the line that I drew from C to B. So this line would be congruent to this line. Okay? And that works for anywhere on the perpendicular bisector. Let's say that I plotted a point right here. Okay? If I drew a line, let's call this line point D. If I drew a line from D to B and then from D to A, they're going to be the same distance from each other. They're going to be congruent. Also notice, instead of doing student notes over there on the right, I've got a section for you to do student questions. So anytime during the lecture, if you have questions, just write it down. And then whenever I pause and ask questions, you'll have it in case there was that way you don't forget it. Or in case your question doesn't get answered, or if I walk around and see that everybody has a lot of the same questions, I can address it. Okay. All right, so before we do any actual math, what questions do you have for me? Okay. Let's do an example. It says find the length of RS. Okay, so it wants me to find this length here. Well, I can see that point S is on the line SQ. Well, I notice that line SQ is perpendicular to the segment RP, and I see that point Q is its midpoint. So that tells me right away that line SQ is the perpendicular bisector. So since this is the perpendicular bisector, I know that SR would be the same distance as SP. And if SP is 6.8, SR is also going to be 6.8. All right, let's do one together. It says find EG, and first thing you need to do is write down the number that I whited out. So notice if you look at your picture that I whited out some numbers. EH is 24, GH is 24, and FG is 9.5. And it wants me to find the length of EG. So before you even try to figure it out, you need to figure out what is EG. Well, it's all the way from E to G. Okay. So you need to, in order to tell if these two sides are congruent, you need to see if point F is on the perpendicular bisector. Brett, would you say that point F is on the perpendicular bisector?
Yeah.
How do you know?
Right angle.
Okay, the right angle. Something else that tells us that it's perpendicular on the perpendicular bisector is because these two are the same length. So you have to be given that this is a right angle. Then you also either have to be given that these two segments are congruent, the EF and FG, or these two segments, FH or GH. So there's two things you have to be given to determine it's the perpendicular bisector. It has to be perpendicular, and either it's in the midpoint or it's equidistant from the two endpoints. Okay, and since both of those are 24, I know they're congruent. Okay, so with that being known, is there a way for me to find this side length over here, EF?
Yeah, 9.5.
Yeah, it's going to be 9.5, because since this is the perpendicular bisector, these two are congruent. All right, so EG is the entire segment. Bailey, how would I find EG? What would I do? Yeah, you add them together. So do 9.5 plus 9.5. And Nick, what do you get when you add those together?
19.
19. So your answer is 19. This one here, first thing you need to do is fill out that number that's missing. It says find the length of CD. Now, in order to find CD, you have to make sure that this line is the perpendicular bisector. Abby, can I say that BD is the perpendicular bisector of segment AC?
Yeah,
Why?
because AB and BC are congruent, and also there's a right angle.
Perfect. Yeah, these two are marked congruent, and there's a right angle, so this is the perpendicular bisector. So now I can find CD. Maddie, what would be the length of CD? Perfect. Yep. So since D's on the perpendicular bisector, these two segments would be congruent. Therefore, CD would be 27. All right. What questions do you have for me before we move to chunk 2? Oh wait, no, we have another one, don't we? Is this one on your paper? Okay, I just didn't delete this one. Okay, angle bisector. Remember, an angle bisector cuts it into two congruent angles. So an angle bisector is a ray that divides an angle into two congruent angles. And what the angle bisector theorem says, if a point lies on the angle bisector of an angle, then it is equidistant from the two sides of the angle. Alright, so what that means is, I can tell that this is an angle bisector because these two angles are marked congruent. So that's how I know it's an angle bisector. The two small angles are congruent. Well, if it's congruent, then that means any point on this line, so at point D, is equidistant to the sides. Bless you. So from D to B, that's going to be congruent to the segment D to C. They're going to be the same length. Now, you have to check for a couple things before you can say that they're congruent. You have to check to make sure that these two angles are marked congruent, and you have to check to make sure that these are right angles. They have to be right angles. They have to be perpendicular. And it's vice versa. If you know that these are perpendicular and these two segments are the same, then you know these two angles are the same. So it goes back and forth. But you just have to make sure that these are perpendicular and these are congruent or these are congruent. All right, so it says find the measure of angle GFJ. Well, first I gotta figure out which angle is GFJ. Well, there's GFJ, so that's this angle right here. Well, first thing I notice is that both of these two segments are congruent, and these are right angles. So that tells me this is the angle bisector. So if this angle is 42 degrees, this angle here is 42 degrees. Make sure you fill in that 42 that was on the bottom. Okay. It says ray BD bisects angle ABC. By bisect, it means it cuts it in half. So that means this angle and this angle would be congruent. It says DC is 6.9. Find the length of BA. Grace, what would you say the length of BA was? Yeah, what would be the length of this segment? This is the angle bisector, so it's equidistant from the sides. So if this side's 6.9, what's this side over here? 6.9. All right, we will finish these on Monday. Do not forget to not to bring anything tomorrow. And enjoy the rest of your day.